Vitaly, are you there? Thank you. I see the recording is now also working. Thank you for agreeing to be recorded. Yes. Let's move on. So Vitaly Chernetsky is a professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas. He is the author of Mapping Post-Communist Cultures, Russia and Ukraine in the Context of Globalization, a Ukrainian language of which came out in 2013, a book upcoming in Ukrainian called, in English, Intersections and Breakthroughs, Ukrainian Literature and Cinema Between the Global and the Local. And then he is a co-editor of a bilingual anthology of contemporary Ukrainian poetry, Letters from Ukraine, which came out in 2016, and an annotated Ukrainian translation of Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism from 2007. His talk today is called Recognizing and Addressing Epistemic Injustice, Russia's War Against Ukraine and a Paradigm Shift in Slavic and East European Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome Vitaly. Please give a virtual welcome on your screens or however you can do it this way. Vitaly, thank you.
Thank you so much, Russell. Thank you so much, everyone at Indiana, including the hardworking team of interpreters. As somebody who has done a lot of interpreting in my own life, I really appreciate the hard work that goes in there. Доброго дня всім. Вітаю. Good
afternoon, everyone. Greetings.
Today about a concept and a strategy that is something that folks in this room will probably need no convincing to understand and appreciate. But what I hope we can find in what I'm proposing is a way of explaining to our colleagues, especially our colleagues outside Ukrainian studies, why studying Ukraine matters, why listening to Ukrainian voices and informing themselves of Ukrainian perspectives is really, really important. So I do have a PowerPoint that is going to be a little text heavy, and I apologize for that in advance, but I hope that you will find some useful concepts there for your future work. And so without further ado, I'll try to share screen and start. And it's working, and let me go to slideshow and play from start. There we are. Okay, so epistemic injustice. And we need to start that. No one in this room needs reminding this, but we all remember very well that the experts' opinions, the experts' predictions at the time of Russia's shifting to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine a year and a month ago was seen that, Ukraine might heroically resist for 2 or 3 days, but that would be it. Just this morning on NPR News, there was again an expression of surprise of how Ukraine is continuously resisting and putting up a very strong fight, that Bakhmut still hasn't fallen and maybe will not fall at all, and Ukraine will actually start a counteroffensive. In other words, Ukraine has been consistently defying international experts' expectations. And so many in that global expert community who wrote Ukraine off early on had to admit that they knew and understood a little about Ukraine, that they had a habit of recycling uncritically absorbed stereotypes and ideological talking points, many of them, of course, of Russian imperialist origin. And from that, we moved to a situation that some of them, many of them, but unfortunately not all, and this is the whole gist of my talk today, had to admit to a history of marginalizing Ukrainian studies within the broader study of Eastern and Central Europe and Eurasia, and of ignoring or dismissing Ukrainian voices. And this is, again, will be something that will be familiar to many. Ukrainians very often were called to provide emotional authenticity, but not informed knowledge. So the concepts through which I propose to look at this is primarily the concept of epistemic injustice and related concepts from critical epistemology. Critical epistemology is a branch of philosophical inquiry that analyzes how knowledge is generated, how knowledge is shared, how pursuit of knowledge exists across humankind, and how it goes sometimes in not a barrier-free way, that there are, in fact, a lot of barriers. So my main thesis here is that the failure to understand Ukraine and appreciate its concerns testify to an existence of an entrenched pattern of epistemic injustice towards Ukraine. In other words, that Ukraine, as a knowledge generator, as a knower, as the philosophers would say, was not given a just equal representation at the global symposium, if you wish, exchange of knowledge. At the same time, as we all in this virtual room are well aware, Russian military assault against Ukraine was prepared by and is accompanied by a campaign of epistemic violence against Ukraine, of Putin's notorious pseudoscientific article about Ukraine and its history and identity half a year before the start of the full-scale invasion is just one of those examples, but the consistent, peculiarly enduring dismissal and attempt to erase Ukraine as an entity intellectually is an example of epistemic violence. So epistemic violence accompanies consistently the very real violence that is horribly perpetrated against Ukraine by the Russian invaders. So a little bit about the concept of epistemic injustice, a little bit of a brief history. It is situated at a cross-connection between political philosophy, ethics, and epistemology. And this concept grows in its development, especially to feminist philosophical inquiry. So it was feminist philosophers who were at the forefront of pushing it, but more recently also intersectionally to scholarship on race, class, sexuality, disability, and other related concepts. The major development occurred after the publication of the British philosopher Miranda Fricker's book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, and you see the cover of that book on the slide, published by Oxford University Press in 2007. And just 10 years later, there was also a massive tome published by Routledge, the Routledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice, co-edited by three philosophers, Ian Kidd, Jose Medina, and Gail Paul-House Jr. And speaking to my philosopher colleagues, I was glad to learn that actually the concept of epistemic injustice is very important, that this is considered one of the hottest, if you wish, areas of development of contemporary philosophical discourse. If you look at Google Scholar for epistemic injustice, the number of hits will be quite astounding. So what are the roots? What are the origins? And the origins start indeed, as I mentioned, with feminist philosophy, with Sandra Harding's concept of standpoint epistemology, articulated first in her book, The Science Question in Feminism, and then later in Whose Science, Whose Knowledge, and Donna Haraway's concept of situated knowledge, formulated in a response to Harding. Very importantly for us, as we are also engaging in explaining and helping the world get greater understanding of Ukraine, its history, its current predicaments, and what it can share at the global exchange of ideas. Epistemic violence is also something that has been talked about in the context of post-colonial discourse, post-colonial theory. Very importantly, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak speaks of it in her classic essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? More recently, we've seen this concept really engaged with strongly in the decolonial theory discourse, and that is an offshoot and a response to the original post-colonial theory that has its origin in the intellectual discourse of Latin America, and one of its leading exponents is the Argentinian scholar Walter Mignolo, and he has a very important article that I have highlighted here, Epistemic Disobedience, Independent Thought, and Decolonial Freedom. And so for him, this is there is a such thing as a geopolitics of knowledge, which would be a good, concise way of describing of how production and sharing of knowledge happens around the world. And so epistemic disobedience is what he calls for in the response by the marginalized knowers, marginalized intellectual agents within the world. So a little bit more of explainer about Fricker's book. She identifies two types of epistemic injustice, what she calls testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice is when prejudice causes a hearer, that is somebody with whom information is shared, to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. And in her book, Fricker speaks as an example is the testimony of a victim of sexual assault in a sexist society. We all familiar with blaming. She should not have dressed so provocatively. She should not have gone to that party, and so on and so forth. And so the credibility of the speaker is deflated. Similarly, and here Fricker invokes the familiar case of the book To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Black person's testimony in a racist society. So the white jury in To Kill a Mockingbird did not treat the Black person testifying as an equally credible witness. So testimonial injustice thus can be said as something that is caused by prejudice in the economy of credibility. And Fricker also speaks about a special case of silencing in advance or preemptive testimonial injustice caused by structures of social power. And this is what happens when there is not even an opportunity given for a knower, for somebody who can share something important to speak, to share that, the routine exclusion. They're not even realizing that there is somebody who can importantly present their perspective. A different kind of injustice that Fricker speaks of is hermeneutical injustice. And hermeneutical injustice is when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their own social experience. And the example she gives is sexual harassment in a society where this concept does not exist yet, and so a person who experiencing it knows that something is wrong, but she cannot make sense of what is going on. So this is caused by structural prejudice in the economy of collective hermeneutical resources. Since there are injustices, she also speaks of the potential corresponding virtues of testimonial justice and hermeneutical justice. So a virtue of testimonial justice is when we identify that there is potential for identity prejudice impacting the hearer's credibility judgment, so you detect and you correct for. So you think that there is a previous history of neglecting, marginalizing, not even giving a platform to speak to a particular kind of knowers, and so you make an special effort, go an extra mile if you are somebody who is organizing or participating in a community of intellectual exchange to account for that. As for hermeneutical injustice, I would just quote Fricker here directly because she put it so well. The justice would be alertness and sensitivity to the possibility that, quote, the difficulty one's interlocutor is having as she tries to render something communicatively intelligible is due not to its being a nonsense or her being a fool, but rather to some sort of gap in collective hermeneutical resources. The speaker is struggling with an objective difficulty and not a subjective failing. And again, philosophers have mostly used that, discuss these things on familiar internal social issues, questions of racial, class, gender, and other kind of marginalization. But what I am arguing here and what I'm suggesting is that as we look at these concepts, we keep in mind the problems those of us in Ukrainian studies and colleagues who are open to and supportive of Ukrainian studies have encountered as we see how the field of knowledge that pertains to Ukraine, how it operated before the full-scale invasion, and what sort of barriers we are still encountering as we are trying to effect a paradigm shift within it. So in addition to the two types of epistemic injustice that were identified by Fricker, one of the co-editors of the Routledge Handbook, and this is a colleague I'm honored to consider a personal friend. She's a professor of philosophy at Miami University in Ohio, not that far from those of you who are in Bloomington. And this is willful hermeneutical ignorance. Speaking about this, Pohlhaus says that in classical epistemology, the epistemic agent, that is somebody who is inquiring and who is generating and sharing knowledge, is assumed to be non-social, both generic and simultaneously self-sufficient. And again, it was feminist epistemology that back 40 plus years ago strongly introduced the factor of sociality in how we consider knowledge production, how we consider history of science, how we consider history of all broad scholarship developing. So we have simultaneously situatedness of a knower, that is social position, draws attention to the particular aspects of the world and develops a particular habit of attention. So depending on where we are situated as knowers, certain things to us will be quickly evident or very easy to grasp, while others would be much more difficult. And interdependence, epistemic resources are by nature collective. In other words, you do not do your learning, you do not do your acquiring of knowledge entirely on your own. It is almost always a part of some sort of collective enterprise. So dialectical tension between these, that is between situatedness and interdependence, may lead to an expansion of possible knowledge, but it also can lead to a distinct form of epistemic injustice. And willful hermeneutical ignorance does not describe a thwarted epistemic agent who is not believed or cannot make sense of her world. Instead, it describes instances where marginally situated knowers actively resist epistemic domination through interaction with other resistant knowers. However, dominantly situated knowers nevertheless continue to misunderstand and misinterpret the world. In other words, we are dealing here with an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions. And as Paul House asserts, this is simultaneously an agential, that is pertaining to a person, and a structural injustice, that is pertaining to the broader situation, a broader field. So this is one of those text-heavy slides, but please bear with me. A marginally situated knower is more likely, Paul House says, to find gaps in the predominantly held epistemic resources for what is noticeable to her in view of her situatedness. So the marginalized knower can see more than the dominant knower. And vulnerable to others, marginalized knowers must be aware of concerns of those to whom they are vulnerable, but those dominantly situated need not know anything of those concerns. And here, W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness of a Black person in a white-dominated world would be an example. So the Black person who is a marginalized and oppressed and a racist society has to be aware of the prejudices, wrong assumptions, negative stereotypes, and other things that are held by many members of the dominant white majority. That there is this certain systemic prejudice, but an average white person might not necessarily be aware and does not need to be aware. And in order to continue operating in the world, it's of course a good thing if they are aware that they try to change things, but this is something that has to come from them. And here, a great example of how this is structurally similar to the situation of Ukraine on the global symposium of knowledge exchange is what Oksana Zabushko said about the predicament of a Ukrainian writer on a global literary scene. And I'm here referring to her speech at a conference at Rutgers University back in 1992, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the late 80s, there was a series of conferences that included meetings between Western, Central European, and Russian intellectuals. The Lisbon Conference of 1988 is the most famous example of those. And Ukrainian intellectuals were not invited to any one of those. And Zabushko was a last-minute afterthought addition to the 1992 conference, but she made a very effective use of that. And she spoke precisely about this situation using the parallel of Jakob Gladstein, who is an outstanding modernist Yiddish language poet and a translator of T.S. Eliot, among others, into Yiddish. So Gladstein once said, Zabushko quoted him, is that T.S. Eliot does not need to know about my existence, but I need to know about T.S. Eliot's existence. But Zabuzhko continued, too bad for T.S. Eliot, because actually knowing about both makes you richer. And here, coming back to Sandra Harding and her contributions, Harding said that being marginally situated leads not to different knowledge, but to more objective knowledge. Marginally situated knowers are in a position to notice the inadequacies in our epistemic resources that are more entrenched. Interdependent resources developed from marginalized situatedness are, as she puts it, experience rich. This is, again, think of Ukrainians in the global interchange of ideas, and therefore suited to more of the experienced world in general. However, dominantly situated knowers can and do often preemptively dismiss the epistemic resources which could help them to know the world in light of marginalized situatedness. And examples that Gail Polhouse talks about are white privilege and heteronormativity, something that we see operating in the US society and in much of the Western societies, but we can see how, by analogy, sort of the privilege, the Russian privilege in the Soviet and post-Soviet context, if one can put it this way, has also been an example of that. If those who are in a dominant position take an interest in how the world is revealed from marginalized experiences, they can participate in what Harding has called a critical standpoint. In other words, ignorance is not something to which one is doomed because of social position, but rather something that one chooses to maintain. It's not that if you are a part of a dominantly situated community vis-a-vis social power or vis-a-vis knowledge production, that's it. You are guilty in advance and there's no redeeming things. So it's not about hating someone. It's about the fact that you need to make an effort to participate in a critical standpoint. So Fricker was very influential, but from right away, other philosophers started probing and expanding this. And the Gail Polhouse's article is one example, and a paradigm proposed by another philosopher, Christy Dodson, who I believe, if I remember correctly, is based at the University of Michigan, is she says that epistemic injustice is just a subset of epistemic oppression. So in her model, in her interpreting of the situation of how knowledge production functions and how within the global society, is that one needs to proceed from the assumption that there may be types of epistemic exclusion that have not yet been conceptualized and that diverge from Fricker's model. So in other words, we have discovered some injustices, but we need to try to continue analyzing further and see if there are others that we have not yet discovered. And so the concept of epistemic oppression, as Dodson defines it, refers to persistent epistemic exclusion that hinders one's contribution to knowledge production. Epistemic exclusion, as it is used in that definition, is an unwarranted infringement on the epistemic agency of knowers. An epistemic agency is the ability to utilize persuasively shared epistemic resources within a given epistemic community in order to participate in knowledge production, and, if required, the revision of those same resources. So epistemic oppression as a broader system within which instances of epistemic injustice can happen. So if one compares Fricker's model with Dodson's model, what folks have emphasized is that Fricker's model takes the perspective of those who do or potentially do harm and moves away from the perspective of those who are targeted by the harms of epistemic injustice and oppression. So Fricker focuses more on how somebody who is in a dominant position, how can this person be a good knower, rather than focusing on how to contend with the harm that is already done. Dodson's framework uses a systems approach focused on epistemic agency and focuses on epistemic exclusion. And as very often philosophers talk about several orders of exclusion, first order, second order, and third order. So first order exclusion, according to Dodson, is inconsistency, is how the system is utilized and or run. And Fricker's case of preemptive testimonial injustice, the silencing in advance, would be that example. Second order exclusion is that the system needs to be more fully developed in order to facilitate epistemic agency more equitably. And Fricker's concept of hermeneutical injustice would be an example of that. But Dodson says that there is a possibility of a third order exclusion when we find that the entire system is inapt for attending to epistemic interests of particular knowers, and a new epistemic system is needed. So this brings into focus how epistemic systems can actively and not just passively harm, and this leads to Dodson's emphatic call for decolonizing epistemology. In addition to these models, there is also an important concept of epistemic exploitation, which has been developed by another philosopher, Nora Berenstein. And you see, it's all feminist philosophers primarily advancing this cause. And epistemic exploitation, Berenstein says, is when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to produce an educational explanation about the nature of the oppression they face. So in other words, it is on the oppressed, it's on the exploited, on the marginalized to explain why that happens. So they have this, in addition to suffering those exploitation, harms, also needs to do the extra job of explaining. So in other words, marginalized persons are manipulated to spend time and energy on this labor rather than on other pursuits that might be more beneficial for them. In other words, rather than looking into, for example, the case of Ukrainian history, finding out the suppressed innovative thinkers, cultural producers whose work, whose ideas, whose contributions have been denied, and making our own understanding as scholars of Ukrainian culture and history richer and stronger, we have this demand put on us to explain why do we think that Ukraine has been ignored and marginalized. So why is it that, so prove to me, in other words, that you are suffering harm. I do not believe that you're suffering harm, and it's on you to prove that to me in order to me to even give you a chance to listen. They also are thus placed in a double bind, having to choose between allowing ignorance and false claims about marginalized people to go unchallenged. And so in our case, it would be allowing prejudiced anti-Ukrainian stereotypes, entrenched negative beliefs, Russian imperialist talking points continue to be regurgitated as received knowledge, or providing epistemic labor with the knowledge that it is improbable that some dominatedly situated knowers will change their understanding at all, and that may they well refuse to treat the knowledge and claims of marginalized knowers as legitimate. It's all about you being overly emotional and overly sensitive. Don't be the shrinking violet. Don't be this woke person who is just obsessed about some injustices in the world. The world will be fine just without you. And so go back to your corner. So that kind of attitude. And another related concept is epistemic imperialism. This is notion that is developed from the concept of cultural imperialism, advanced and among others by Iris Marion Young. And the idea is that the standpoint of the privileged, their experiences and standards are constructed as normal and neutral. And this is where we have another concept introduced by Gail Polhouse. It's another very influential article by her, the so-called wrongful requests to understand. The examples is when dominantly situated knowers ask marginally situated knowers to take on the ways of understanding that are grounded in the experiences of the dominantly situated knowers and disavow their own. So that is a subset of that. So wrongful requests to understand, again, examples that are often given is racist societies, white privileged societies, where a Black person is forced or another racially marginalized person is forced to say, but the poor thing is not to blame for being racist. That's how this person has been educated. And we have to understand that they just could not, perceive the injustices, that they could not see the harm. It's just so entrenched in them. And so you have to understand. And let's look at the stigmatized racial minority in the case of East Central Europe. Let's look at the Roma community. So a Roma person being told that they have to understand the perspective of the non-Roma of Eastern and Central Europe, why the non-Roma folks often think that, all Roma are potential criminals, that they are not to be trusted, that, one should keep away from them, and so on and so forth. So the pressure is to understand the prejudices and accept the prejudices of the dominant position. And again, Ukrainians vis-a-vis the dominant views within the post-Soviet context would be another example that we can really relate to. So what is important is to assert that in such contexts, the calls for neutrality and for understanding all sides is anything but neutral. And it can make certain sides of the situation invisible without appearing to do so, because the dominantly situated person sucks out all the oxygen from the room. They already have the expert position that some others will be more comfortable to accepting and dealing with, and therefore we have this situation of sides not being equal. So this is, in other words, can be conceptualized as the difference between equality and equity. And so what we need, equity rather than equality. So I mentioned Jose Medina earlier as one of the co-editors of the Routledge Handbook. He is a philosopher originally from Spain, now based at the University of Chicago, if my memory serves me right. And so his book, The Epistemology of Resistance, is a good place to look here. Medina is a Wittgensteinian philosopher by background, and he speaks about notions of epistemic insensitivity or numbness, or blindness, but he avoids the word blindness because he doesn't want to sound ableist, and conversely of epistemic sensibility. And what Medina says is that we have a situation of a beneficial epistemic friction that is necessary for overcoming active ignorance, that it's not going to be a smooth journey, that we have to realize that the friction will be there, and this friction, he says, is a good thing. And for this, he articulates two regulative principles: the principle of acknowledgement and engagement, and the principle of epistemic equilibrium. Testimonial injustices concern, he argues, not only epistemic deficits that the oppressed subjects have to endure, but also the epistemic excesses, the excessive authority and credibility and the excessive self-confidence that privileged subjects enjoy. And again, within our field, we are all too familiar with excessive authority and credibility of Russian or Russianist voices that assert their viewpoints, their opinions, without the possibility of others even having that kind of engagement. And they're given in advance excessive authority and credibility, while others are given diminished authority and credibility. So he proposes a system, what he calls of polyphonic contextualism, as a vision for virtual interpretive responsiveness that offers a more robust notion of epistemic responsibility with respect to hermeneutical justice. And so, having identified all these problems, what are the changes? How can we affect the changes? So let's start with Fricker. Change begins at home is a phrase we often hear, and starting with oneself is not a bad approach. So remember, Fricker's focus is on the dominantly situated knowers who may not be aware that they were participating in a situation of epistemic injustice, and they need to look into themselves and make themselves aware and sensitive and change. So Fricker encourages reflexive critical awareness of the likely presence of prejudice, which leads to active critical reflection. And as she emphasizes, there is no clear algorithm here. So for every person, this is going to be, different, but she says there is a clear guiding ideal. The other goal for her is the creation of a more inclusive hermeneutical microclimate between hearer and speaker that leads to the reducing the effects of hermeneutical marginalization. So now that's you make an effort to be inclusive in intellectual exchange. And Gail Polhaus goes further on epistemic agency under oppression. And here, systems approach, in other words, the model that Christy Dodson proposed, is crucial for understanding epistemic harm associated with colonization, among other things. And this is, of course, something we're dealing with in the case of Ukraine. Structures of oppression frame knowers from within the oppressing class as ideal capable knowers, knowers from the oppressed class as less able or incapable knowers. So in other words, again, privileged knowers versus those who do not really contribute important information, or who are just too emotional to be able to rationally think or to contribute important perspectives. So how to address testimonial injustice, asks Polhaus. Is it best to correct an individual within the system, or are there ways of recalibrating the system so that it cannot be misused in this fashion? And this is the big challenge. So we need to shift away from solutions that rely on individuals to self-correct. So yes, it is good for every individual to try to self-correct. It is a noble thing, but in addition to that, or above and beyond that, we need to look towards changes that prevent testimonial exchange, in other words, the sharing of meaning, from being discounted based on identity prejudice. She talks about second-order exclusions here, while those who have been previously excluded are uniquely positioned to identify gaps in the system. Individual knowers can only do so much. So filling those gaps may require cooperative efforts from others who do not notice gaps in their epistemic systems as keenly. So recognizing and addressing prior willful hermeneutical ignorance. So in other words, it has to be an allyship situation where the person in the previously dominant position has to try to reach out and recognize that there was prior willful hermeneutical ignorance. But there are problems also of what the so-called exploitative inclusion. So not all inclusions are just. So example again of the exploitation: call upon others but don't listen to them. So it's dedicto inclusion and a dere exclusion, which simultaneously exploits and discounts the labor. Prove to me that racism and sexism are real. Prove to me that you're really marginalized and that you were not getting an equal presence at the table of knowledge exchange. And another important factor, Paul House, again, here reaches to decolonial thinking, and this is also an Argentinian thinker, Maria Lugones. And Lugones talks about horizontal versus vertical directionality of epistemic work. And horizontal is more important to her because vertical, raising awareness, is not enough. So focusing on agents and not on systems may very well be an oppressive epistemic system itself. So we need to look at the system, we need to reach out to potential allies and seek developing allies among others who may also be experiencing epistemic oppression, epistemic exclusion, and build coalitions. And in other important thing I would like to bring up here is Chandra Talpade Mohanty and her book, Feminism Without Borders. So knowing without borders, what she proposes as a decolonial epistemic practice. And what this means is investigating the contingent and current borders that enable and disable knowing in particular instances, and recognizing that epistemic borders that we animate, these are the borders that we create, have effects on others, considering what changes are needed to work across or reshape these epistemic borders, and working collectively to enable such shifts. And without borders does not mean ignoring borders. Sometimes borders are very important, but we need to see where this border is positioned, how this border operates, and how we acknowledge this border, but simultaneously work beyond it. And the solution she proposes is practicing solidarity. But this is not a solidarity that is secured in advance as a basis for struggle, but struggle itself as a basis for solidarity. Knowledge is not assumed in advance, but it is achieved among knowers who are struggling together in resistance. And this is an example of democratizing the learning experience. And again, where is Ukraine in all this? I've been talking about this, asking you to keep in mind Ukraine and the predicament of Ukrainian studies, Ukrainian knowledge generated by scholars of Ukraine and by Ukrainians in this global exchange of ideas. For far too long, Ukraine, which as we know is the largest country fully situated in Europe and a country with a large population, 52 million at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a bit less now, it has been small on people's mental maps. References to Ukraine as a small country were routine in global media and global expert opinions. So we can counteract the epistemic violence that is part of the current Russian aggression in Ukraine by addressing the epistemic injustice in regard to Ukraine in our academic environments. And so what we need here is an epistemic paradigm shift. So this is what we need to call our non-Ukrainianist colleagues to try to do. And we hope there will be enough virtuous knowers among them to listen and to participate. Recognize and confront entrenched anti-Ukrainian prejudice. Many of us in Ukrainian studies or of Ukrainian background can testify to horrible examples of prejudice thrown in our faces as we were pursuing our intellectual work. And this should not be approached as a temporary problem in need of a temporary solution. So yes, of course, Ukraine is now on the front pages of newspapers, so we need to pay more attention, and then it will just conveniently go away, and those bothersome Ukrainians will just disappear in the dark corners where they should be, because that's where they were before. One has to recognize that returning to the status quo ante is impossible. We need to create resources for and encourage pursuits of studies of Ukrainian language and culture in the broadest defined. So in other words, in order to hear those perspectives, you also need to try to learn the perspectives as they articulated in the language in which they articulated. And we all know of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. We all hear about how, for instance, understanding of conceptual categories of Native American languages lead to a more virtuous, for instance, ecological coexistence between human and non-human population of our planet. Here, hearing Ukrainian and hearing them in Ukrainian would be equally important. And not only literature, but examples from other culture. We all know how difficult, for instance, or many of us know at least, has been to get classical music world paying attention. And seeking out Ukrainian resources, thank you, Russell, on global, regional, comparative, and theoretical topics. Taras Shevchenko's Kafkaz, as we all know, is a pioneering articulation of anti-colonial solidarity of the oppressed. We know that, but the broader community does not. That this poem anticipates by more than a century what later would be articulated by Franz Fanon, for example. Lesia Ukrainka is an outstanding feminist writer and thinker of global relevance. Ivan Дзюba's Internationalism or Russification as a dissident Marxist critique of Russo imperialist features of the Soviet project. And this is especially important talking to colleagues on the left political spectrum in the intellectual world who persistently somehow believe that because Soviet Union in their model was a force for good against bad Western imperialism, therefore contemporary Russia should be supported and everyone who is against contemporary Russia is to be treated with suspicion. Do not mislabel Ukrainian artists and intellectuals as Russian. Do not subsume Ukrainian history into Russian. And this is another call that we've made very strongly, and we have seen how this is beginning to be addressed, for instance, in museum practices. We should call them to listen to Ukrainian voices and to understand that the work of undoing any ignorance on unconscious biases on their part is not the burden of those Ukrainians who are addressing them or Ukrainian studies specialists, but theirs, those who are trying to develop a more nuanced understanding. And it needs to be emphasized that they need to be respectful and politically responsible in their inquiries and do not re-traumatize folks from Ukraine who have been absolutely traumatized, each and every one of us, by the horrors of Russian war crimes. Most importantly, we should encourage everyone to practice solidarity. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. Дякую дуже. Слава Україні.
Thank you, Vitaly. That was a wonderful presentation. I wasn't signaling you. Those are just my notes. I was putting them up.
Sorry, because I had the share, I was worried that you were saying me that there's
I was just doing this. I was just thinking because I was noting all sorts of things down during your talk, and I
no worries.
wanted to talk to you about them. That was really, really fine presentation, very rich and nuanced case for knowledge production and learning and dissemination of knowledge about Ukrainian culture and history, especially on the part of those who have tended to neglect it. And it ties in nicely also to some of the other presentations that we've had earlier and discussions, particularly this morning, about ideology and language. It made me think of that. So I just have one comment for you, or a question. I turn it over to our audience because I'm sure they will have some. But and it runs kind of throughout your talk, since you started with the anecdote, the assumption that many in Western news circles and military had at the beginning at the end of February of last year, when Russia first invaded, that Ukraine would not be able to resist for very long, and that was tied to a kind of ignorance about Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian It was also, you didn't really spend very much time on this. It's the other piece. And I wanted to see where you would take this. Maybe this is deliberate on your part, but it's tied to a kind of inflation. I would call it epistemic inflation of Russia, and in the knowledge of what Russia looks like for people who study it, or even just in popular representations of it. And you didn't really, I mean, I suppose that's Fricker a little bit more, but even there, it's not really Fricker. It's you brought in her, I think, very constructively to talk about the field and how members of the field can position themselves and understand where they are more carefully. But yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more about this this other piece. You said, yes, Ukraine is small on the mental maps, but that's because Russia is, at least in part, Russia is big on people's mental maps. And this inflation has tended to color their perceptions also of Ukraine. And those two things are tied together. And I'm wondering how you would situate that thing that would say, well, it's not just you need to know more about Ukraine, but your understanding of Russia is flawed, right? That's the other side. And so that's my question for you.
Thank you so much, Russell. You've just coined a new philosophical term. I don't think I've encountered the phrase epistemic inflation, but I think this is something that can be indeed very productively conceptualized. So this is, this is wonderful. There have been a lot of other terms. One thing that actually a term that I've encountered and that'll be quite interesting is epistemic gaslighting. So gaslighting is a term that has been used a lot, and gaslighting usually refers to psychological manipulation, but there has been talk about epistemic gaslighting as well. In terms of, and this is in part related to what you are talking about, in that, yes, the efforts and insistence, the paradigm that we've had within our field is that the big nations or big cultures or great cultures versus little cultures, less important, sort of less commonly taught. We all know, those of us associated with area studies institutes, about the advocacy for teaching liktals, less commonly taught languages, of which Ukrainian is, for better and worse, still one. So yes, this is something that we need to see, the recalibration of the field, the reorientation of what, so the rebalancing, this epistemic rebalancing of resources, that is something that Medina talks about. It means that if something is given more prominence, it means that somebody else or that area needs to be reconceptualized too, and this is not a zero-sum game, even though we have a finite resources in terms of time and energy, but giving the perspectives of Ukrainian colleagues or Ukrainian studies specialists greater platform, creates a richer knowledge, more objective knowledge about the broader field, including about Russia. So in other words, that perspective, similarly to, for instance, African-American perspective on sort of, folks enjoying white privilege in US society, is something that enriches their position. So in other words, Russian studies are not in danger of being canceled. What is happening is that they have to become different Russian studies that are informed by the critique that we see very well developed, for instance, in the studies of global Anglophone culture or the global Francophone culture, the legacies of those colonial empires, speaking back to those empires, including speaking back in languages other than English and French. I'm thinking about Ngugi and his famous, essay on the abolition of the English department and things of that kind. So, yes, this also creates a stronger, more diverse perspective on that culture that historically has been dominant and that has to shift its position and presentation within the field as something that is a past empire that, of course, is going to inform the future, but it's not something that will be over-determining things. It's just like with the fall of Roman Empire, the study of Italy did not disappear, but, the presence of Italian culture within the study of, say, the Mediterranean world versus the presence of Roman Empire, those are rather different things in terms of balance. Hope this makes sense.
Yes, thank you. We have about 15 more minutes, I think, maybe 20, in order to have a little bit of time for our interpreters to get a break before the next panel that starts at on the hour. So are there questions or comments from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand if you have one, or you can put it in the chat and we can read it from there. I see one hand, Miriam Schrager. Please, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Hi, thank you for the wonderful and very interesting presentation. I have a question, a practical one. You suggested that how to deal with Ukrainian cultural representatives as opposed to Russian. What do you do with those who were part of Russian culture and you don't know what to consider them? For example, just for me, practically, I'm teaching Russian and Soviet cinema, and I want to include Dovzhenko in my film list. And I know he was Ukrainian, from Ukraine, but he was teaching in Vgik. How do I present him? How do I talk about that? According to your kind of understanding.
Yes, this is a great question. And I also teach, Russian and Soviet cinema classes regularly. And this is something that I have actually addressed many years ago, is that from the very beginning, I say that both in the cases of Russian Empire before the revolution and during the existence of the Soviet Union, we need to distinguish between being related to the imperial center and the kind of backgrounds and perspectives individual filmmakers bring. Also, filmmaking is an inherently collective art form. So in the case of, so I have Dovzhenko, I have Parajanov, I have many other filmmakers represented there. And, going back to, say, the pre-Soviet period, the founder of animation, Władysław Starewicz, is an ethnic Polish person from Lithuania. And yes, he made his first stop motion animation works in Moscow, but it does not mean that he somehow became Russian in the sense of his primary identification. Dovzhenko was in Moscow because he was forcibly exiled from Ukraine. He was actually forbidden from working and teaching in Ukraine. He wanted to come back to Ukraine, but he was prevented from doing so. Sometimes being in the imperial center and imperial capital is not something one does because one chooses that for career advancement, because one wants to have a bigger platform and a bigger audience, but this is something that empire does to you by force. And this is very much the case of Dovzhenko in the situation of after World War II because of how he was attacked for Ukrainian Flames, the project. And so his work in the post-World War II until the time of his death that is very much the case of that a person of colonized background is operating in the imperial center. And yes, he has a tenuous recognition as a member of an elite, but he always has marginalized, he always has that prejudice, and he is there in part because he is actually not allowed. He's forcibly prevented from working in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian environment, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great example. I see Maria Zubritska's hand is up. Maria.
Dear Professor Chernetsky, thank you very much. Дуже дякую for your very theoretical,
Thank you very much.
practical recommendation. In Ukraine, we are very aware what should be done. Much more Ukraine should be translated. We should much more produce a new knowledge about Ukraine, disseminate this knowledge. My question is rather about this outside version. 30 years ago, Professor Baranchak, professor of Harvard University, he taught Polish languages, said about scientific imperialism, because this dominance of Russian culture and Russian literature above all Slavic cultures and languages is not a normal at the university. How you see, after the war in Ukraine or during the war in Ukraine, how the community of Slavic departments or Russian and Slavic departments or Russian and East European languages, etc., how they should raise this awareness that something should be shifted, something should be changed. Maybe comparative approach. We could regard the problem of war and peace in all Slavic languages, not only in Russian languages by Tolstoy. In Ukraine, in Polish literature, we have a lot of perfect novels which depict the problem of war and peace. But it is rather the question to the community, to the professors of departments. It is their responsibility and their response to the event in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Дякую дуже за питання.
Thank you very much for your question.
Share your concern, and I think it's safe to assume that all of us in this virtual room are very much allies in this work. Those of us who are working directly in the field of Ukrainian studies, and those of us who want to amplify Ukrainian voices and Ukrainian perspectives. What we often need to do is, I would say that some of it is a question of time and generational change. So I think that younger colleagues in the field and our students are much more aware of that. And so building allyship with them, and those among the older generation colleagues who are open to critically examining their backgrounds and their positions, because we know that some are and some are not. I would say that I am fortunate, and I know that Indiana is similarly a good example. Sort of, there are many of us in the departments that are historically already very diverse in studying cultures and languages of East Central Europe or the Slavic language family. But yes, we have situations of, for instance, small colleges where there is a small program and the program is called Russian, and they maybe have a one person or, one and a half, one full-time and one part-time person teaching, and they're in a challenging situation. But what is often happening is the situation of developing sort of goodwill. I mean, the mug that I have here, with my morning coffee comes from College of Worcester, a very small college, which has a very tiny Russian program, but they made great effort to actually refocus on Ukraine. Similarly, I've seen examples at Bennington College in Vermont, where, they had in the college with less than 1,000 people, a colleague who previously taught Russian literature only, educated himself enough on Ukrainian literature to actually offer a comprehensive course on Ukrainian literature with a lot of guest speakers from Ukrainian studies. So in other words, while there is a danger in some folks potentially rushing to become overnight experts in another field, and enough of them have humility and willing to cooperate and to create this and to learn. I mean, there are many more examples of that kind, and very often it comes from student pressure. So making students our allies, making junior colleagues our allies, and advocating. The university systems, at least within the United States and many other, national academic systems in Europe and North America, are open to those voices. So having those voices heard, I mean, this is how a lot of other things happened. This is how women's and gender studies, this is how ethnic studies, this is how African-American studies achieved their place on campus. There was a lot of resistance, but this coalition building and fight to change that eventually brought about results. So this is what I would be advocating. It's not going to be an overnight success. It's going to be a struggle, but it's going to be a struggle with a clear goal of positive, good, to which we hopefully will get.
Thank you. That was a very good question, Maria. Overcoming institutional structures does take a while, and you hire people for 30 years and you create a curriculum over 5 to 10 years. So changing it can be difficult, but it is work that I hope everybody is willing to do. Natalia Shulga has a question. Please, Natalia.
Yes. I just want to elaborate more on the previous question with a certain technical ideas for you to comment on. Of course, you need to use a sort of new solidarity, and you talked about it, and about coalitions. But as academic, and with this experience, which took me 5 years in my department to teach people and faculties around that I'm not Russian. Took me 5 years. It was 90s. It was extremely difficult, but I won this game. And actually, I was introduced like, never called her Russian because she will give you a look. So yeah, but my question, what do you think about this whole mythology created by the Russian historians, Russian politicians? They falsified statements about their democracy when you can choose from one candidate and you can change the constitution for this one candidate. Maybe departments of Slavic studies or whatever they name, because different universities choose the different titles, how they would like to name their departments to study this region of the world. What do you think if you create this coalition, not only inside of the department to fight this mythology created by Russians in different subjects, but also the coalition with Department of History, Department with Political Science, Department of Anthropology, Department of Languages, you know, throughout university, not localized to one tiny center, which cannot overcome on its own this huge paradigm shift, which should happen in the nearest future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree with you that the coalition has to be as broad as possible. This is, to me, this is sort of has been an instinct. You know, my education, my PhD is in comparative literature, so I always try to emphasize sort of this kind of bridge building by analogy. And as Jessa was mentioning, Taras Shevchenko and Franz Fanon. So yes, you know the ideas of anti-colonial struggle and solidarity from Fanon, but consider that there was Taras Shevchenko 120 years earlier, and he formulated it very inspiringly and very powerfully, and not knowing that there was this formulation. So Ukraine was actually at the cutting edge of global thought is a loss. It's not a loss for Ukrainians, it's a loss for the world. The world will be richer by knowing and appreciating that, Ukraine is, has been in this avant-garde of thinking. So yes, absolutely, one needs to build a broadest possible coalition of allies. And yes, talk to philosophers who are studying epistemic injustice. Talk to folks in history, political science, anthropology, sociology, across the spectrum within your academic communities. And very often it is at first an uphill climb, but you will find voices willing to listen. I too have had interminable, problems back in the 90s explaining where I'm from, but I also have encountered, conversely, challenges of this kind and deflated credibility within the Ukrainian community. I happen to be from Odessa, and the first time some folks in the Ukrainian diaspora here in North America met me, I was met with more exclusion than inclusion. As an Odessan, I was treated with suspicion. Who is he? How come this Odessan speaks such good Ukrainian? He must be a KGB spy or something. So we should practice what we preach both internally and externally. That's why I brought the example of the Roma community, because anti-Roma prejudice is something that unfortunately we are familiar across entirety of East Central Europe. And yes, so looking at ourselves and modeling that example and reaching out, building these broad coalitions, I mean, that would be the strategy, and not just within your school. This is what we're doing here, which is wonderful. I can say that I'm honored that I will be participating in a workshop that Colgate University will be holding next weekend for all the Russian and East European, Eurasian area study schools in the Northeast, in New England, New York State, and other parts of the Northeast region, precisely for that, as a workshop, how do we change the curriculum? So I think this is letting others know that there are these kind of initiatives, and that would be very good that if we do all that. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm giving not very concise answers, but I think we are here a group of like-minded thinkers, and what we need is to be armed with more tools with our work to effect this change.
Thank you. That is perfect timing. We are going to take a 10-minute break. I see Sarah Phillips put a note in the chat, and yes, let's keep this in mind that Dr. Chernetsky is the incoming elected president of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Asian Studies, so he will have a powerful platform for combating the epistemic injustice he discussed so eloquently here. Let's all support this work. First, let's take a 10-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you so much for again